Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a close look at something incredibly urgent and honestly profoundly important: Canada's megafires. As we've all watched these fires grow to completely unprecedented scales over the last few years, it's becoming crystal clear that our standard approach to land management just isn't cutting it anymore. We're in desperate need of a major shift. And interestingly enough, that shift might just come from looking backward to ancient, proven practices. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at Canada's escalating wildfire crisis, followed by the climate vicious cycle. Then we'll explore cultural burning, overcoming colonial barriers, and finally, funding and carbon markets. Starting right off with Section 1, Canada's escalating wildfire crisis. The last few years have literally rewritten the record books. Just let this number sink in for a second. 15 million. That is the number of hectares of land that burned across Canada in 2023 alone. To put that into perspective, that's more than 7 times the historic national annual average. It's a completely staggering figure that represents a massive, devastating loss of our forests. But the devastation isn't just on the ground. It's up in the atmosphere. 640 million. That's the metric tons of carbon released by those extreme Canadian forest fires between May and September of 2023. That single season of fires put out carbon emissions comparable to the entire country of India's annual fossil fuel emissions. Basically, it's 4 times more than Canada's regular annual emissions. So the crucial point here is that the impact of these megafires goes way beyond environmental damage. It carries an immense human and financial toll. Between 1980 and 2021, wildfire evacuations cost Canada anywhere from $3.7 to $4.6 billion, with over 500,000 people forced to flee their homes. And what's really important to highlight here is the disproportionate impact. Statistically, Indigenous peoples are 30% more likely to be displaced by these wildfires than anyone else. Now, if we look at the very latest data reported by the Canadian government in July 2026, we see this crisis is continually evolving. While the total area burned by midsummer 2026, which was about 1.4 million hectares, is significantly lower than the devastating 4.6 million at the exact same point in 2025, the sheer number of fires actually increased to 3,137. So it shows us that even when the overall acreage fluctuates, the threat itself remains incredibly persistent across the country. Moving right along to Section 2, the climate vicious cycle. You see, these unprecedented fires aren't just a symptom of a warming planet. They're actively making it worse. We're essentially looking at a highly destructive feedback loop. Historically, Canadian forests have been a globally important carbon sink, meaning they absorb more carbon dioxide than they release, which is great for the global climate. But as climate change creates these increasingly dry and hot conditions each summer, we get more massive wildfires. Those fires release huge amounts of carbon, which then further accelerates climate change. Our vital carbon sink is literally transforming into a massive carbon source. When experts talk about solving this puzzle, they usually divide the strategies into 2 buckets. You've got climate adaptation, which is all about responding to the impacts and building resilience against these new hot, dry extremes. And then there's climate mitigation, which is actively trying to reduce the actual emissions. What's absolutely fascinating is that Indigenous fire stewardship is uniquely positioned to tackle both sides of this equation at the exact same time. In this new era of climate extremes, Indigenous knowledge is proving absolutely critical for restoring balance. While climate change is rapidly shifting natural cycles all around us, Indigenous knowledge systems are inherently highly adaptive. They rely on reading the land exactly as it is right now, rather than just following a static, outdated rulebook from the past. Which brings us to Section 3, Understanding Cultural Burning. For decades, Western fire management has basically focused on total suppression. Putting out every single fire as fast as humanly possible. But there's another way. Cultural burning is the practice of intentional fire lighting on the land at low-risk times of the year to achieve specific cultural and ecological objectives. The keywords to remember here are intentional and low risk. This is definitely not about letting wildfires run wild. It's a highly proactive, carefully controlled practice that happens only when the weather and moisture levels are just right. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept in action. Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen from the Indigenous Leadership Initiative explains it perfectly. She notes that while cultural burning is used for cultural goals, like, say, improving a berry patch or bringing in fresh green grass for animals, it makes the entire area healthier. It improves biodiversity, And crucially, because it safely removes all that dead, dry vegetation from the landscape, it significantly reduces the risk of massive, out-of-control fires later on in the season. The benefits here are completely holistic. Yes, for sure, it reduces wildfire risk and intensity, but it also stimulates the growth of important medicines, enhances soil nutrients, basically feeding the earth, and reduces pests. It's about healing the ecosystem as a whole, rather than just treating the forest like a hazard we need to suppress. All right, Section 4, Overcoming Colonial Barriers. Now, you might be wondering, if cultural burning is really this effective, why aren't we doing it everywhere? Well, the historical reality is that this stewardship has been suppressed for a long time. Research points out that this began with the systematic displacement of Indigenous peoples, along with colonial policies that outright outlawed cultural burning. Today, while Western agencies are finally moving away from total suppression and adopting what they call prescribed burning, Indigenous knowledge has largely remained devalued in the process. Gatekeeping and strict agency oversight often make it really difficult for First Nations to practice cultural burning beyond a very small fraction of their traditional territories. But there's a clear blueprint for how to fix this. Researchers Hoffman and colleagues laid out 5 distinct calls to action. 1. Establish a national Indigenous wildfire stewardship working group. 2. Prioritize Indigenous knowledge systems equally in governance to correct those old power imbalances. 3. Reduce the gatekeeping around wildfire science and training. 4. Build a strong network of practitioners to tackle policy barriers like liability and jurisdiction. And 5. Increase financial support for this preventative stewardship. It's a very real, very actionable roadmap for systemic change. And the great news is, we're actually seeing these calls being answered on the ground. Organizations like the RAD Network, which stands for Restore, Assert, Defend, are at the absolute forefront of a growing movement. This movement is all about strengthening Indigenous nationhood and really centering Indigenous leadership and conservation. It's about reclaiming the right to steward the land exactly as it's been done for millennia. Finally, Section 5, Funding and Carbon Markets. Now, what's really interesting here is the economics. If we're going to see a wide-scale return to cultural burning, we have to figure out how to pay for the massive amount of work it requires. Which brings us to a fascinating question. Can cultural burning actually be financed through carbon markets? It sounds like a complex financial concept, I know, but it could actually be the master key to unlocking wide-scale land management reform. It turns out there's already a proven model for this. Over in Australia, Indigenous-led savanna burning generates millions of dollars every single year through carbon markets. By preventing massive megafires, they prevent massive carbon emissions, and then they sell those carbon savings as credits. Now, First Nations in Canada, like the Unisidan and Zeniwetan, who are partnering with the Gathering Voices Society, are actively investigating how to build a Canadian carbon credit framework just like it. And with emerging frameworks like the British Columbia Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, there is a very real, viable, and potentially profitable path forward for Indigenous-led stewardship right here in Canada. We're also seeing direct public investment step up. In July 2026, the Canadian government announced a $1.25 million investment spread across 6 specific projects. These projects involve multiple Métis and First Nations, and they're aimed at training Indigenous wildland firefighters, building local response capacity, and directly integrating traditional knowledge into regional wildfire management, mapping, and planning. Let's step back and look at how all of this builds a completely new picture for the future. What we're witnessing right now is a necessary, fundamental paradigm shift. We're finally moving from the mere concept of integrating Indigenous practices into actual, funded, on-the-ground implementation. It's a return to a balanced, respectful type of land management that works with nature rather than constantly fighting against it. But the clock is definitely ticking. As climate change continues to accelerate this vicious cycle of megafires, we are left with a really critical question to reflect on. How quickly can we dismantle those remaining systemic barriers and fully empower Indigenous fire stewardship before the next unprecedented crisis hits? It's literally a question of survival for our forests, our communities, and our climate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.